It was
The
almost
signal is
midnight when
compromised.
Claire booked her rideshare.
I repeat,
The rain
the signal
outside
is
was
compromised.
relentless,
Abort the
thick
mission.
sheets pouring down like a curtain between her and the world. The air smelled of wet asphalt and distant thunder, and the streetlights bled into the puddles, casting ghostly reflections on the ground. She was exhausted after her late shift at the diner, her eyes heavy, her body aching, and her only thought was to get home, shower, and forget the world existed. The car pulled up quietly, headlights cutting through the mist. A black sedan. She glanced at the app. Same model, same plate number. She got in without hesitation. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a calm demeanor, nodded silently as she buckled her seatbelt. The radio played faintly, a nostalgic hum of old jazz that barely rose above the rain's rhythm. Everything felt ordinary, almost comfortingly dull. But halfway through the ride, she noticed something strange. The driver kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Not the usual quick, routine checks, but long, uneasy stares. Claire followed his gaze out of curiosity, turning her head slightly to look behind her. The back seat was empty, just her duffel bag. Nothing else. Still, the driver's eyes flicked nervously to that same spot again. Claire frowned. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the gentle hum of the rain. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. The car swayed slightly before he steadied it. "Just don't look back," he said quietly, his tone almost pleading. A chill crept up Claire's spine. The wipers screeched against the windshield as lightning flashed, illuminating his face. Pale, strained, terrified. "What do you mean?" she whispered. "Please," he said again, voice shaking. "She doesn't like to be seen." Her heart pounded in her chest. Claire turned her head despite his warning, slowly, as if drawn by some invisible pull. And for a split second, just one, she saw a faint, flickering outline of someone sitting right beside her. The air distorted like static on a broken television. The figure was motionless, but the head seemed turned toward her, face obscured, form glitching in and out of existence like a corrupted image. Claire gasped, snapping her head forward, pressing her back against the seat. What was that?" she stammered. The driver didn't answer. His knuckles were white, his breathing shallow. "I've driven this route before," he whispered. "Once. Same woman. Same seat. But when I dropped her off, she disappeared before the car stopped moving." Claire felt every hair on her arms rise. The air felt colder now, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The sound of the rain faded to a dull hiss, and the music warped, slowing down as though someone was dragging their fingers through the tape. Her reflection in the window flickered slightly, lagging just half a second behind her movements. Her stomach dropped. "You're scaring me," she said. "I didn't mean to," he muttered. "But she's been following my rides ever since. Sometimes she's quiet. Sometimes she whispers." He paused, eyes darting to the mirror again. "She's here tonight." Claire clenched her fists, her breath shaking. "Stop the car," she demanded. "Please, just stop." He pulled over by the roadside, under the broken glow of a streetlight. The rain slowed to a drizzle. She fumbled for the door handle, but her phone buzzed violently in her lap. The screen lit up, a rideshare notification. Her heart skipped. It said, "Your driver has arrived. Please meet your car." She stared at it, frozen. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to the driver, who looked just as horrified. "What is that supposed to mean?" she whispered. He didn't answer. The radio hissed, a burst of static echoing through the car, and then softly, a voice, distant and hollow, came through. It sounded like her own voice. "Don't get out yet." Claire dropped the phone, her pulse hammering in her ears. "What's happening?" The driver shook his head, whispering something under his breath she couldn't make out. Then the world outside seemed to shimmer, lights bending unnaturally. The same streetlight flickered on and off, and every time it blinked, the car seemed to move slightly forward. Yet neither of them had touched anything. When it finally steadied, Claire was sitting alone in the back seat. The driver was gone. The car engine hummed quietly. Raindrops crawled up the windshield instead of down. Her breath fogged the glass, and she could see movement again beside her. A faint, static shimmer, slowly turning its head. The door clicked open by itself. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet pavement and something faintly metallic. Claire stumbled out, heart pounding, and ran through the empty street. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The next morning, she tried to convince herself it was exhaustion. A hallucination, maybe, but when she checked her app's history, her blood ran cold. The receipt showed 2 passengers listed for that ride, one named Claire Bennett, and the other, beneath it, in faded text, unknown user, no profile data. And at the bottom, the timestamp was wrong. The ride had been completed tomorrow night. The weekend was supposed to be simple, quiet, disconnected, peaceful. Emily and Aaron had been together for 5 years, living in the constant hum of city life, surrounded by screens, deadlines, and sleepless noise. So when Emily found an old farmhouse listed for rent in a small rural town, cheap, remote, surrounded by whispering trees, they both agreed to escape for a few days. The drive there was uneventful, long and winding. The sky shifted from blue to pale gray, and as they turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the farmhouse, it felt as if they were crossing into another time entirely. The house stood solemn and perfect, wrapped in ivy and silence, with a small windmill creaking gently in the yard. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and lavender, and everything looked frozen in a memory. Wooden beams, floral curtains, a ticking wall clock. Emily smiled, taking it all in. Aaron set down the bags and exhaled deeply. "This is perfect," he said. That first night was calm. They drank wine by the fireplace and talked about how badly they needed to unplug. Outside, the cicadas hummed in slow rhythm, and the air carried that soft summer heaviness that makes time feel slower. When they went to bed, everything was ordinary: warmth, comfort, the soft creak of old wood under their movements. But the next morning, something was off. Emily woke first. Sunlight streamed through the window in thin golden lines. She blinked groggily, reaching for her phone on the nightstand. The battery icon showed 100%. She frowned. She hadn't plugged it in. When she turned to Aaron, he was still asleep, perfectly still. That was fine. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she froze. The wine glasses they'd left out were gone. The plates had been washed and stacked neatly. Even the crumbs from last night's bread were gone. She called out for Aaron. He appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Did you clean up last night?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. You did, didn't you?" "I didn't." They both laughed it off. Maybe one of them did it without realizing, drunk or half asleep. It didn't matter. But something about the air felt heavier that morning. The ticking clock seemed louder. The house seemed too perfect. That night, the same thing happened. They cooked dinner, left dishes out, fell asleep by the fire. The next morning, everything reset again. Dishes clean, beds made, laundry folded. Even the firewood had been res-tacked. Emily started recording things on her phone. She filmed the living room before they went to sleep, the clutter, the glasses, the books. But in the morning, when she played back the video, the room was already clean, even though she was certain it hadn't been before. Aaron grew distant, irritable. "You're obsessing," he said. "It's just your imagination." But one night, Emily woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, soft against the wooden floor. She froze. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, but the sound of movement came from the hallway, measured, almost mechanical. She reached for Aaron, whispering his name. He didn't stir. She held her breath as the footsteps stopped outside their door. The doorknob turned slightly, just enough to creak. Then silence. When morning came, Aaron acted like nothing had happened. But he looked pale, his eyes unfocused. "I had the strangest dream," he murmured. Someone was standing at the foot of the bed. Emily didn't answer. She didn't tell him she'd seen the same thing. That evening, she left her phone recording overnight again, this time on the kitchen counter. Before sleeping, she whispered into the camera, "If this happens again, we're leaving tomorrow." But when she woke up, Her phone was on the nightstand beside her. Battery full, screen black. When she played the footage, it started with her voice. But then something strange happened. Her image froze mid-sentence, and a faint whisper followed, overlapping her voice. A voice that sounded exactly like hers. "You weren't supposed to remember." Emily dropped the phone, heart pounding. Aaron stood in the doorway, pale and silent. "What did you say?" he whispered. She shook her head. "It wasn't me." That's when they noticed the time. The clock on the wall was stuck at 3:07 a.m. Yet the sunlight was pouring in through the window. They checked their watches. 3:07. Every clock in the house showed the same time. Frozen. Desperate, they packed their bags and ran to the car. But as Aaron turned the key, the engine didn't respond. No click, no sound, nothing. The world outside was dead quiet. Even the windmill had stopped moving. Emily's breathing turned shaky. "We just need to walk," she said. But when they stepped back toward the dirt road, the air shimmered faintly, like heat rising off pavement. The horizon blurred, folding in on itself. It was as if the world was on a loop, bending endlessly. They turned back toward the house, only to find it standing there exactly as before, doors wide open, curtains fluttering gently. Inside, the clock ticked again, perfectly in rhythm. Emily's phone buzzed. A new notification appeared. "Recording complete. Night 17. Her stomach turned cold. They had only been there 3 nights. Aaron looked at her, his face hollow. "How long have we been here?" he whispered. The answer never came, and as the narrator's voice fades, the sound of a ticking clock grows louder. Steady, mechanical, eternal. Then silence. It was nearing 2 a.m. when David pulled his truck into the small, dimly lit parking lot of a roadside motel. The neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering, casting a sickly red glow on the wet asphalt. He'd been driving all day, hauling cargo across state lines, and the exhaustion was pressing against his eyelids like a physical weight. He needed rest, and this decrepit motel promised just that. A room, a bed, 4 walls and nothing else. Inside, the air was stale with the faint odor of mildew and disinfectant. The fluorescent light above the door buzzed intermittently, humming a monotonous lullaby. He dragged his bag to the room, dropping it on the stained carpet, and exhaled, letting his body sink into the momentary relief of finally stopping. The bed sagged in the middle, springs groaning, and the heater clicked and whirred, filling the silence. David took a quick shower, letting the hot water wash away the fatigue and tension of the long drive. That's when he noticed it, the bathroom mirror. Nothing about it seemed wrong at first, just another cheap motel mirror, slightly fogged with condensation. But as he stepped closer, brushing the steam from the glass, he noticed a subtle delay. His movements didn't perfectly match the reflection. His hand rose, and a fraction of a second later the reflection followed. His eyes narrowed. "Must be tired," he muttered, rubbing them. He stepped back, blinking hard. The delay persisted. He waved a hand. The reflection lagged again. The room felt suddenly smaller, suffocating. The hum of the fluorescent light seemed louder, the air heavier. He leaned closer, studying his mirrored self. The reflection's eyes held a glint that wasn't quite his own, a calculation, a knowledge that he didn't possess. Panic prickled the edges of his mind. "I need sleep," he whispered. But sleep felt impossible now. Minutes passed. He moved slowly, testing the mirror, and the reflection started to act independently. A smile curled at the edges of its lips, just slightly before he even had time to move his mouth. David's breath caught. He stumbled back. The reflection didn't stumble. The air seemed to vibrate with a static-like hum, subtle at first, then growing louder in his skull. The heater clicked in sync with his racing heartbeat. He reached for the doorknob, thinking to leave the bathroom, but the reflection raised its hand, a mirror image that didn't align with his own. He froze. The seconds stretched, taut as a wire. The reflection's head tilted, studying him. And then, in a movement so slight, so unnatural, it was almost imperceptible, it leaned closer, whispering something that made the blood drain from David's face. He couldn't hear the words, but the feeling, bone-deep dread, was unmistakable. Something about the reflection wasn't just watching. It was aware, waiting. David stumbled back toward the bed, heart hammering, but his movements felt sluggish, as though the air itself resisted him. He tried to laugh it off, shaking his head, insisting to himself that he was overworked, overtired, imagining things. But the reflection, his mirror self, was following him now, moving with a clarity and intent that made his skin crawl. He grabbed a chair, hurling it toward the mirror, shattering glass with a resonating crash. Shards scattered across the floor, catching the flickering red neon from the window. His breath came in ragged gasps, and for a moment silence returned. Relief, safety, until he noticed the blood. Not his own, dripping across the floor, but streaks forming on the mirror itself. Red, viscous, unnervingly vivid. And then, impossibly, the reflection reformed, whole, intact, smiling, unmoved, even before the glass had fully shattered. David's stomach twisted. He wanted to run, to escape the motel, the room, the house, the reflection. He bolted for the door, slamming it open, rushing down the corridor. But the hallway was wrong. The walls stretched slightly, elongated, bending his sense of direction. The fluorescent lights flickered in a rhythm that made his head spin. Every door seemed identical. Every shadow flickered with subtle life. In the lobby, the night clerk wasn't there. Just the hum of the old refrigerator, the low buzz of broken neon outside. David stumbled back to his truck, shaking, drenched in sweat. But when he reached it, his headlights illuminated something on the windshield. Smudges, fingerprints, not his own. And faintly, scrawled in condensation, "I saw you first." The radio in the truck sparked to life suddenly, crackling with static before faint whispers overlapped, echoing his own voice. "David, stay." He slammed the door, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but in the rearview mirror, something moved that shouldn't have been there. Not a reflection of the road, not a shadow cast by the trees. A figure, standing still, pale, watching him with eyes that seemed impossibly deep and knowing. David drove without looking back, the rain pelting the windshield, the night stretching endlessly. But the memory of that mirror, its delay, the independent movement, the smile, was etched into his mind. He knew, without understanding how, that some reflections were never meant to be confronted. And as the sound of the tires on wet asphalt fades into the eerie hum of silence, the narrator whispers. It was just past midnight when Marcus settled into his small radio studio. The city outside was quiet, the streets slick with recent rain, neon reflections stretching like liquid through the empty avenues. Inside, the studio smelled faintly of coffee and old electronics, a mixture of warmth and dust. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, rubbing his eyes. Another long night. Another shift with nothing but the hum of equipment and the occasional caller seeking a fleeting connection. The broadcast began routinely, low jazz playing softly through the speakers, punctuated by his smooth, calm voice. He had done this countless nights, narrating songs, sharing minor city updates, and listening to voices that never quite seemed to belong. But tonight, something felt different. The static in the headphones crackled longer than usual, almost forming words. The first call came in quietly, a voice that seemed familiar, yet distorted, softly warped, like underwater sound. Marcus leaned closer, adjusting the mic. "You're live on the air. Who's calling?" The line was silent for a moment. Then the voice spoke, calm, precise, and unnervingly intimate. "Marcus, it's me." He chuckled nervously. "You must have the wrong number. This is a public radio show." "I'm not wrong," the voice replied. He knew his name. "It's me. I know everything about you." The hairs on the back of Marcus's neck stood up. He froze, gripping the microphone. What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know the apartment you lived in at 21. I know the exact words your mother whispered before she left. I know the lie you told your friend last summer. I know everything. Marcus's pulse hammered in his ears. The sound of the static became unbearable, rising and falling with an almost sentient rhythm. He could feel the weight of those words pressing into him, a deep, twisting dread. The studio felt smaller, the walls inching closer, the hum of equipment turning into a low, mechanical chant. Who is this?" he demanded, voice trembling. But the voice laughed softly, a hollow echo that seemed to come from every corner of the studio. "You already know," it said. "You've always known." Marcus dropped the headset, scrambling to check the recording device. Everything looked normal. No signs of tampering. No evidence of a call. Just his own voice echoing softly through the empty studio. His heart raced, the sensation of being watched crawling across his skin like icy fingers. He picked up the receiver again. Nothing. Silence. Only the low hum of the analog equipment, which now felt like a countdown, ticking closer and closer to some unseen moment. Then, faintly, from the speakers, came a whisper. His own voice, but not quite him. Higher pitched, slower, deliberate. "You shouldn't have answered." Marcus staggered back, shaking, fumbling with the controls. The screen of the recording console blinked, flickering images that didn't belong. Frames of him asleep, moments he hadn't recorded, snippets of conversations he didn't remember saying. The line of reality seemed to fracture. The studio transforming into a liminal space where past, present, and possibility overlapped. He remembered a story he had read once, about people hearing versions of themselves from alternate timelines, warning, guiding, or threatening. But this felt personal, intimate, real, and horrifying. He wasn't being called from somewhere else. He was being confronted by himself, or something that had become him in another form. Desperation clawed at him. Marcus tried to turn off the console, pull the plug, escape. But the lights dimmed, the sound of static swelling into a deafening roar. The whispers became sentences, then paragraphs, then entire memories of his life, spilling over the equipment in waves of distorted sound. He could hear the laughter of friends, the final words of arguments, even the moments he thought forgotten, all being replayed, judged, catalogued. Then silence. Marcus fell back into his chair, trembling, drenched in sweat. The studio was empty. The city outside remained quiet. The rain slowed to a drizzle. His hands shook as he reached for the playback. When he hit play, the recording was blank at first. But after a beat, a single phrase emerged, spoken in his own voice, though impossibly altered. "You will hear me again." He looked around, realizing he wasn't alone. Or maybe he was. He couldn't tell anymore. Everything familiar, his life, his surroundings, his identity, felt stretched, fragile, a thread in some invisible matrix. The air seemed charged with possibility and dread, as if reality itself were waiting, watching him unravel. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Lily noticed it first, her son, Ethan, speaking in ways that no child his age should. He was 5, small and curious, with messy brown hair and wide, searching eyes. But one evening, as she sat reading in the living room, he looked up from his blocks and said, "Mom, the tree outside will fall tomorrow at 3. She froze, heart skipping. "Ethan, trees don't just fall like that," she said, brushing it off as coincidence. But the next day, while she was at the grocery store, she got a call. Her neighbor's voice trembled as they explained the tree in the yard had indeed fallen. Exactly at 3, crushing the fence and narrowly missing her car. Panic simmered beneath her calm exterior. Was it luck, imagination, or something far more sinister? Over the following weeks, Ethan's knowledge grew. He spoke of events before they happened, minor at first, then horrifyingly precise. A window shattering in the living room, a car accident on the nearby road. He even described conversations she hadn't had yet, quoting exact words she intended to say. His tone was calm, detached, as if these revelations were mundane facts rather than unsettling prophecies. The atmosphere of their home shifted. Morning light felt colder. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Every object in the room seemed to hold significance, potentiality, waiting to align with Ethan's predictions. Lily tried to rationalize it. Children have vivid imaginations. Maybe he overheard something. Maybe it was all coincidence. But the dread clinging to her chest whispered otherwise. One night, she recorded him on her phone, hoping for proof, hoping to rationalize her fear. She asked innocuous questions like what he had done at preschool, what he would eat for breakfast. His responses were correct, perfectly mundane. But then, his eyes, wide and unblinking, stared into the camera. And he spoke of something she had never told anyone. Something private. Something that would happen the following week. An event she could not yet fathom. The recording played back strangely. First, his voice sounded normal, then slowed, distorted, overlaying itself with another. Older, deeper, and eerily familiar. It whispered, "You'll never leave this town." Lily's stomach dropped. She rewound the footage, double-checked, but every playback confirmed it. That voice wasn't hers, or at least it wasn't the her she knew. It was a version of her that had already experienced this warning, trapped in some loop she couldn't understand. Fear gripped her nights. She watched Ethan sleep, his chest rising and falling steadily, the soft rise and fall of a child untouched by horror. But every so often, his eyelids fluttered as though he were watching a different reality while she remained trapped in this one. She tried to speak to him, to ground him, to make sense of it, but he would only smile faintly and say things he couldn't have known. The tension in the house became suffocating. Doors felt heavier. Mirrors reflected shadows that didn't belong. Even the air seemed charged, as if vibrating with knowledge they could not perceive. Lily's own reflection in the bathroom mirror startled her. Her eyes seemed too tired, her face drawn. She felt watched not just by Ethan, but by something beyond him, something using him as a conduit. Neighbors began to notice subtle oddities too. A package arriving before it was sent. Lights flickering in patterns too regular to be natural. She kept these observations to herself, afraid of disbelief, afraid of being deemed unstable. But Ethan remained calm, almost bored by the tension, as though he understood the fragile illusion of their world better than anyone. One evening, exhausted and trembling, Lily asked, "Ethan, how do you know these things?" He tilted his head slightly, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I see them, Mommy. I see before they happen. Some people can't. Some people forget." Her heart pounded. Forget? What did he mean? The thought of her own life, memories, reality, being unreliable, fragile, suddenly filled her with terror. She tried to pull him close, but the sensation was fleeting, as though reaching into a mirage. The final moment came unexpectedly. She woke to the sound of a whispering wind outside. Ethan stood at the window, gazing at the stars, and softly said, "I've seen it again. Me. Falling. Dying. But not yet." Her scream caught in her throat. He didn't cry. He didn't shiver. He only smiled faintly, calm and knowing. And in that smile, Lily felt the full weight of incomprehensible dread. Her child. Her own flesh and blood, connected to a reality she could never touch, never change, never understand. It was nearly 2:15 a.m. when Jonathan pressed his foot down on the accelerator, driving home along the desolate highway. The night was thick, oppressive, and unbroken, save for the yellow streaks of headlights cutting through the fog. He had been on the road for hours, hauling cargo across empty stretches of state line, feeling the familiar pull of fatigue weighing on his eyelids. The radio played softly, static-laden but comforting, a lullaby against the hum of the engine. As he glanced at the dashboard, his eyes caught the clock. 2:17 a.m. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, then looked again. The next moment, his stomach dropped. The clock read 3:17 a.m. An entire hour gone. He frowned, confusion twisting into unease. Had he fallen asleep at the wheel? That was impossible. He remembered every mile, every passing mile marker. His hands tightened on the wheel. The fog outside thickened, wrapping the world in a gray haze that distorted the familiar stretches of road. He checked the GPS. It blinked erratically, the usual route home replaced with a long, looping path he did not recognize. The road stretched ahead endlessly, each curve identical to the last, the dashed white lines bleeding into one another like a broken film reel. Panic began to creep in. He was moving forward, yet the scenery repeated itself, endlessly. The trees on either side seemed to lean closer with every passing mile, their shadows crawling along the asphalt like living things. Jonathan reached for his dashcam, hoping it might reveal some clue. The recording played back, showing the same road, the same fog, but with a disorienting twist. The dashes of the lane markers flickered, skipped, and occasionally duplicated as though the video itself were corrupted. And there, in the grainy footage, he saw himself, stepping out of the truck mid-drive, walking beside it, then vanishing before reaching the horizon. His pulse raced, adrenaline surging, the engine's hum now deafening in his ears. Every instinct screamed to pull over, to escape, to run. But the road offered no exit. The GPS flickered again, then recalibrated with impossible precision. He was now 60 miles away from any familiar marker. The fog warped around him, twisting into shapes, shadowy forms that mirrored his own movements but ahead of him, as if some unseen force were always one step forward. His phone buzzed violently. He reached for it, trembling. A voicemail notification appeared, dated and time-stamped during the missing hour. Hesitant, he played it. The voice was his own, but altered, slower, deliberate. It described actions he had not yet taken. Turns in the road he had not remembered making, conversations he had not had, locations he had not visited. His own voice recited a sequence of movements that he could not comprehend, yet he recognized the familiarity of tone, the cadence of his own speech. A chill ran down his spine. The night outside had grown impossibly still. No sound of tires on asphalt, no whisper of wind through the trees, just the static hum of his own heartbeat, echoing against the walls of his consciousness. The dashcam flickered again, showing scenes that could not exist. Roads bending unnaturally, signs with names he did not recognize, shadows that elongated and shifted independently of the streetlights. Jonathan tried to shake the feeling of unreality, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. Every instinct screamed at him, he was not alone. And then he saw it, faint at first, a figure walking along the edge of the road, just visible in the fog, matching his movements exactly. Every step, every glance, every subtle shift of posture mirrored perfectly, yet not him. The shadow smiled faintly, a knowing, impossible expression that made his stomach churn. Desperate, he slammed on the brakes, swerving onto the shoulder, the tires grinding against gravel. The figure stopped. The fog thickened, obscuring it from view. Jonathan's mind raced, replaying every detail, every sensation. The missing hour was no accident. It was orchestrated, a glitch in perception, or worse, a deliberate manipulation of reality itself. He glanced back at the dashcam one final time. The missing hour was recorded, but distorted. And there, in the corner of the frame, another version of himself sat silently in the passenger seat, staring directly at the camera with eyes full of quiet accusation. Jonathan's pulse thundered as he realized the impossible truth. He had already lived this moment before, or perhaps he would live it again. The hum of the engine resumed, the fog slowly dissipating as the first light of dawn painted the horizon. Yet even as the world returned to normal, the unease remained, an indelible mark that reality had shifted, however briefly, and that some parts of existence could never be trusted again. Every night, at precisely 3:33 a.m., Peter noticed her. At first, he thought it was a trick of the mind, the shadows cast by the streetlight outside his apartment complex. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Across the narrow alleyway, in the top-floor window of the abandoned house, a woman stood, motionless, watching, waiting. Her presence was subtle, almost fragile, yet it sent a shiver crawling up his spine every single time. The city around him was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from the rooftops. The autumn wind carried a cold bite, slipping under his jacket and through the tiny gap in his window. Peter sipped his lukewarm coffee, telling himself it was stress, imagination, or maybe a prank. But each night, the figure remained, framed in the faint amber glow of the long empty apartment. Curiosity warred with fear. One night, Peter grabbed his camera, determined to capture the apparition. The viewfinder trembled in his hands as he focused. The woman was there, exactly as before, long dark hair cascading past her shoulders, silhouette pressed against the glass. But something was off. She didn't blink. She didn't shift her weight. Her gaze was fixed, unervingly steady, and he could feel it, though he wasn't in the same room. It felt as though her eyes pierced through him, reading him, understanding him, knowing every detail he had ever tried to hide. Weeks passed and Peter became obsessed. He stayed awake nights, watching, documenting, even leaving small notes on his windowsill, wondering if she could read them. Sometimes, when he blinked, she seemed closer, as if the distance between them had narrowed in some imperceptible way. His friends noticed his growing exhaustion, the hollow look in his eyes, but he couldn't tell them. They wouldn't believe him. The first real terror struck when he captured a photograph. He had managed to snap a single shot in the dark, hoping to prove he wasn't losing his mind. Later, reviewing the image on his computer, his blood ran cold. The figure in the window wasn't alone. Behind her, in the faint reflection of the glass, stood another person. His own reflection, staring directly at him, eyes wide with the same paralyzing fear he had felt nightly. Sleep became impossible. Even when he closed his eyes, he saw the flicker of that window, the woman's unblinking stare, and the terrifying awareness that the reflection wasn't just his own. It was something else, something that knew him better than he knew himself. Shadows seemed to stretch longer in the corners of his room. Whispers of movement echoed down the empty hallways, and the line between observer and observed began to blur. One night, desperation overcame caution. Peter approached the alley, camera in hand, stepping into the cold, empty street. The house was quiet, still as though waiting. The air smelled faintly of decay and wet leaves. He called out, voice cracking, "Who's there? What do you want?" No answer. Only the window, and the faintest movement, a turn of the head, just enough to suggest recognition. Peter stumbled backward, heart hammering, realizing that the distance between his world and hers was more fragile than he could comprehend. Returning to his apartment, he reviewed the footage again. Every frame seemed warped, flickering slightly, and each flicker revealed a different version of the woman. Sometimes older, sometimes younger, sometimes blurred as if shifting between realities. And always, his own reflection lingered behind her, smiling faintly. It began innocuously. Marco had just moved into the suburban apartment complex, boxes stacked high in his living room, the faint scent of fresh paint still lingering in the air. He was eager for a fresh start. New city, new job, new life. Everything was clean, structured, ordinary, until the neighbor moved in across the hall. At first, Marco barely noticed him. A tall man, mid-30s, quiet, polite, always dressed neatly, always smiling politely, nodding when they passed in the hallway. But soon, subtle oddities began to appear. Small, almost imperceptible things. The neighbor would arrive at the elevator at the exact same moment, always mimicking his movements. If Marco hummed a tune while carrying groceries, the neighbor hummed the same tune, almost in sync. If he paused to tie a shoelace, so did the neighbor. At first, Marco dismissed it. Coincidence, paranoia, stress from the move. But the patterns grew impossible to ignore. One evening, Marco returned from work late. The apartment was dim, quiet, the hum of the heater filling the silence. He passed the neighbor's door and noticed a faint glow from under it. He peeked into the slightly ajar door and froze. The neighbor was there, arranging furniture in the exact positions as his own living room, mirrored perfectly, even the same brand of lamps, same color of rug. Marco's stomach churned. How could he possibly know? How could anyone know so much about his private space? Sleep became uneasy. Every creak of the hallway floor sounded like footsteps echoing in sync with his own movements. Shadows outside his door seemed longer, bending unnaturally. He began to notice things missing or altered in his own apartment. A cup shifted slightly on the counter. A book opened to a different page than he remembered leaving it. The uncanny feeling of being mirrored, duplicated, invaded his thoughts. Desperate for answers, Marco decided to confront the neighbor. He knocked, heart pounding, but the door opened before he could finish the first knock. The neighbor smiled, same warm, polite grin, and gestured him in. The apartment looked normal, lived-in, cozy. He tried to speak, to voice his unease, but the words stuck in his throat. Then he noticed the photograph on the wall. Himself, sitting at the exact same desk he had placed in his own apartment, looking out a window that mirrored his view perfectly. He reached toward it, trembling. The neighbor's smile deepened, unervingly calm, almost rehearsed. "We've been neighbors a long time," he said. But Marco knew they had only met weeks ago. Panic clawed at him. He ran back to his apartment, locking the door, checking every corner. Everything was as he left it, yet he could feel the presence, the subtle, intimate mimicry, watching, learning, echoing. The floors creaked even when no one was there. Shadows bent toward him, and the sense of déjà vu became unbearable. Every thought, every movement, felt anticipated, mirrored, replicated. He began documenting it, recording video, taking photos, writing notes of every occurrence. Reviewing the footage terrified him further. In the corners of frames, he saw the neighbor, sometimes standing behind him, sometimes in another room, frozen like a ghost, perfectly synchronized with his actions. Sometimes there were two of them, both smiling, both mirroring him, both impossibly present. Eventually, Marco stopped leaving his apartment. He avoided hallways, streets, even the windows. The neighbor still appeared, always at the edges of his vision, perfectly mirroring his movements. Shadows deepened unnaturally, reflecting impossible angles, as if the laws of space itself were bending to accommodate the presence of this duplicate. One night, exhausted and terrified, Marco fell asleep on the couch. He awoke to the faint sound of the door opening. The neighbor stood there, identical in every way, but his smile was slower this time, deliberate, knowing. And then the impossible happened. Two Marcos, himself, sat on the couch, staring blankly at the floor, breathing shallow, mirroring his exact posture. The neighbor whispered, calm and low, "It doesn't have to be this way. You can join me, or become them." Marco's heart raced, his mind fraying. Reality fractured in that apartment, blending with something else, something mirrored, something infinitely patient. Every movement, every thought, every choice seemed anticipated and duplicated. The walls themselves seemed to close in, reflecting multiple versions of him, each more hollow, more terrified, more trapped than the last. The narrator's voice cut softly, chillingly intimate. It started as a mundane Monday evening for Sarah. The office building was quiet, most employees gone, the fluorescent lights humming softly above her cubicle. She had stayed late, finishing a report for a deadline that didn't forgive procrastination. The clock ticked closer to 11:30 p.m., and she decided it was time to leave. The elevator was empty, doors sliding open with a muted chime. She stepped in, pressed the lobby button, and let the familiar motion soothe her frayed nerves. But the elevator didn't move as expected. The soft hum of machinery persisted, yet the floor indicator flickered strangely, skipping numbers, settling at impossible digits. She pressed the button again. Nothing changed. Panic rose slowly, then sharply, a cold claw curling around her spine. The air inside the elevator felt heavier, as if time itself were pressing down, stretching and compressing simultaneously. Sarah tried the emergency phone, but it only emitted static. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a staccato rhythm, casting long, twitching shadows across the metal walls. Her reflection in the mirrored panels seemed delayed, lagging just a fraction of a second behind her movements. She waved a hand. Her mirrored self did not respond immediately. It followed, then paused, as if considering the action before copying it. Minutes or maybe hours passed. Time was a slippery concept inside the small, metallic box. She pressed buttons at random, hoping for some intervention, but the elevator remained suspended between floors, trapped in limbo. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The floor indicator displayed a number that didn't exist, G47. The doors opened briefly, revealing only darkness beyond, a void where walls should have been. Sarah stepped forward instinctively, drawn to the blackness. The sound of the hum shifted, warping into whispers, faint at first, then growing clearer. Voices spoke her name, sometimes in her own tone, sometimes in an unfamiliar, distorted echo. They recited thoughts she had never spoken aloud, secrets she had hidden from even her closest friends. Each whisper was deliberate, intimate, impossibly precise. A sudden flicker of light revealed another figure standing in the corner. Tall, shadowed, faceless, yet undeniably human in form. It mirrored her stance perfectly, even moving slightly before she did. Her pulse accelerated, heart pounding against her ribs as the realization set in. This was not a reflection. This was something else. Something mimicking, studying, learning. The elevator shifted again, moving slowly downward, or maybe upward. She couldn't tell. Each floor that passed seemed unfamiliar, impossible. The numbers skipped, twisted into sequences that defied logic. She caught glimpses of corridors that didn't exist in her building, rooms filled with objects she had never seen, yet somehow recognized. A child's toy, a photograph, a notebook filled with her handwriting but dated decades earlier. Exhaustion and terror blurred her thoughts. She tried to shut her eyes, to force herself to sleep, to escape this impossible prison, but the mirrored walls multiplied her panic. Every blink revealed subtle changes. The shadow closer, the air colder, the whispers louder. She could hear her own heartbeat echoing unnaturally, distorted, as if someone or something had amplified it to torment her. Then the doors opened again. A hallway stretched before her, dimly lit, yet unfamiliar, infinite. She stepped forward cautiously. The shadow followed, keeping perfect pace. Every instinct screamed to run, but the hallway bent and twisted, elongating endlessly, turning into a labyrinth where every door led back to the same elevator. She realized with growing horror that there was no exit. Sarah stumbled back, heart hammering, and slammed the elevator doors shut. They closed with a heavy, deliberate click. She pressed the button for the lobby again. Nothing. The mirrored walls rippled subtly, as if liquid, and her own reflection blinked independently. The shadow inside the mirror smiled. A slow, deliberate, knowing smile that carried a message she understood instantly. There was no escape. The narrator's voice lowers, a whisper threading through the tension. Some elevators don't just carry us between floors. Sometimes they carry us between realities. And when the doors open, we may no longer recognize the world waiting on the other side. It was just after midnight when Claire decided to walk home. The city had emptied, leaving a hushed, almost reverent silence over the streets. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting elongated shadows that stretched and twisted across the cracked pavement. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain that had fallen earlier, mixing with the distant hum of a neon sign from a nearby diner. Claire's footsteps echoed, each one a reminder of her isolation in the dim, deserted city. The first time she noticed something strange, it was subtle. A building she swore she had passed before, an alley that looked eerily familiar. She shrugged it off, attributing it to fatigue and the monotony of late-night walks. But as she continued, the sense of déjà vu intensified. A lamppost bent in a peculiar way, a graffiti tag repeated on every corner, and every street she turned onto seemed to fold back onto itself. The world around her felt wrong, as if she were moving in circles, trapped in a loop she couldn't break. Her pace quickened, anxiety prickling at her spine. She pulled out her phone to check the map, only to find the streets displayed incorrectly, paths twisting impossibly, names changing from familiar to unfamiliar with every glance. Panic began to seep in. She tried to retrace her steps, hoping to recognize a landmark, a building, anything that would anchor her to reality. But every street, every turn, brought her back to the same place. A corner she knew she had passed several times, yet it should have been impossible. The repetition grew unnerving. Claire began to notice details that should not have existed. Objects in the same positions, people frozen in place, even stray papers on the ground identical to those she had seen moments before. She called out to anyone, hoping for human presence, but only the echo of her own voice answered, bouncing off the walls of buildings that seemed to lean closer, watching, waiting. Time, too, felt distorted. Minutes stretched endlessly, then collapsed. Her phone's clock would skip forward, then rewind, displaying conflicting times. The rain that had fallen earlier was now both fresh and dry in inconsistent patches on the pavement. Each attempt to escape only reinforced the looping streets, folding her deeper into an impossible geometry that defied all logic. Claire's mind raced, searching for rational explanations. Sleep deprivation, hallucinations, perhaps some bizarre prank. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Reflections in store windows and puddles did not mirror her movements precisely. When she raised her hand, the reflection hesitated, then moved slightly differently, just enough to feel conscious, aware, observing. A figure appeared ahead, a man standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her. As she drew closer, the figure mirrored her movements with uncanny precision. She turned sharply, but the figure mirrored the turn before she completed it. Fear gripped her, twisting her stomach into knots. She ran, heart hammering, only to find the street behind her had shifted, transformed, yet remained identical. It was impossible, yet inescapable. Breathing heavily, she ducked into an alley, hoping to find a new route. The alley seemed familiar too, the graffiti on the walls repeating itself, the trash cans in the exact same positions as before. The echo of footsteps began behind her, her own footsteps, perfectly synchronized, yet multiplied. Shadows stretched unnaturally across walls, bending and curling in impossible ways. Finally, she stopped, chest heaving, trembling with exhaustion and terror. The city around her had become a maze, a place where repetition was law, where each step repeated endlessly, and where time itself seemed to loop like a broken film. The man, or whatever it was, stood still at the far end of the alley, smiling faintly, as though aware that she could not escape. Marcus had never noticed the apartment above his until the night it spoke. He lived alone, enjoying the quiet solitude of the 5th floor of a mid-century building with creaking floors and faintly humming pipes. The neighbors were mostly absent, the occasional murmur of footsteps or laughter echoing from distant corridors. But that night, as he settled into his worn armchair with a book, he heard it. A soft tapping from above, rhythmic, deliberate, almost like Morse code. At first, he assumed it was someone moving furniture, or perhaps a maintenance worker. But the pattern persisted, too deliberate to be random. Marcus pressed his ear to the ceiling, straining to decipher it. The tapping seemed to spell words, phrases, even sentences. At first, they were harmless, simple greetings, casual observations, but gradually, the messages grew personal, intimate, impossibly accurate. "Marcus, you're alone," one tap clicked. He froze. How could anyone know his name? His pulse quickened as the taps continued, spelling out details about his life, his routine, his fears. The apartment above, he realized with mounting dread, was occupied by someone or something that knew him entirely. Over the next few nights, Marcus became obsessed. He would sit in the armchair, waiting for the tapping, writing down every message. The words grew darker, more insistent. They spoke of things he had done in secret, thoughts he had never shared, moments of weakness he had buried deep within himself. Each tapping session left him shaking, every fiber of his being vibrating with fear and disbelief. The atmosphere in his apartment changed. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, corners darkened even with lights on, and the air grew thick, heavy, almost viscous. Marcus felt watched, not just by the tapping above, but by the very walls around him, as though the building itself had become aware. Mirrors reflected movement that wasn't his, and the hum of electricity seemed to pulse in sync with the messages from above. One night, desperation overcame caution. Marcus set up a camera to record the ceiling, hoping to capture evidence of the mysterious occupant. As he reviewed the footage, his blood ran cold. The ceiling was empty. No person, no furniture, no signs of habitation. Yet the taps continued, recorded in perfect clarity. Even more terrifying, shadows on the ceiling formed vague, humanoid shapes that moved in impossible ways, stretching and bending as if independent of physical laws. He tried to confront it verbally, shouting upward, demanding answers. The tapping accelerated in response, almost frantic, spelling messages that seemed to anticipate his words before he even spoke. He realized with chilling clarity that this presence was not just aware of him. It was orchestrating his experience, manipulating reality in subtle, terrifying ways. Sleep became impossible. Marcus began to hear whispers between the taps, faint at first, then overwhelming, echoing in his mind even when the apartment was silent. The messages became threats, predictions of things he could not yet understand, warnings of outcomes he could not escape. He tried leaving, but every time he returned, the tapping resumed, identical in rhythm and content, as if the apartment above had been waiting for him all along. The final, most terrifying moment came when Marcus noticed a shadow descend from the ceiling, hovering just above his head, mimicking his own movements in perfect synchrony. It smiled, a slow, deliberate, knowing smile that carried the promise of inevitable repetition. Mark's footsteps echoed hollowly in the near-empty depot, a cavernous space filled with rows of stacked pallets and humming fluorescent lights. The night shift was ending, but the warehouse felt different tonight, heavier, charged with a presence he couldn't identify. Every creak of the metal roof, every distant drip of water from the skylights seemed amplified, as if the building itself were alive, observing him. His deliveries were done, yet an uneasy tension clung to him like a second skin. He walked toward the staging area, carrying the final manifest, but the rows of boxes that should have been orderly now seemed wrong. Shadows pooled along the aisles, twisting unnaturally, bending angles of light that should have been straight. Mark's pulse quickened. The familiar space had become alien, and the longer he stared, the more he felt an unseen gaze tracing his every move. The first anomaly revealed itself in a row of crates near the back wall. Several boxes, identical to ones he had just delivered, were stacked neatly, but these were not labeled correctly. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged, almost as though it had been scratched by claws. Mark crouched, inspecting them closely. A chill ran down his spine. He knew he had delivered everything accurately tonight. These boxes shouldn't exist. As he straightened, a faint scraping noise echoed from the far corner of the depot. Mark froze, every muscle taut. The sound was slow, deliberate, measured, something moving between the shadows. He swung his flashlight toward the noise, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing visible, yet the sense of being watched intensified, pressing down on his chest. The depot, a place he had navigated hundreds of nights, had transformed into a maze of tension, alive with unseen intent. Mark moved cautiously, each step deliberate. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, and every shadow shifted as he passed, curling around the stacks of crates like smoke. A low whisper drifted from the far corner, almost imperceptible. "You shouldn't be here." He froze, swallowing hard. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a trick of the acoustics. Carried weight, purpose, a subtle promise of danger. The warehouse felt like a trap, each aisle elongating as he progressed, every familiar turn warped by unseen forces. Mark's flashlight flickered, casting sudden, jagged shadows that seemed to move independently of the boxes and beams around them. Every instinct screamed escape, yet his feet were rooted to the floor. Something unseen was orchestrating the night, guiding him, testing him, watching how he reacted. A sudden clatter erupted behind him. Mark spun, shining the flashlight toward the sound. A box had fallen, yet no one was visible. The stack had been undisturbed moments before. He swallowed, tension knotting his chest, realizing that whatever was present was patient, deliberate, and aware. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against him like a tangible weight. He shivered, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The whispers grew louder, closer, threading around him. Return, see, understand. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears.